30,000 feet above the shattered skies of Europe, the air trembles with the distant thunder of engines. A formation of American bombers crawls through the cold stratosphere, huge, slow, and exposed. Below them, black bursts of flak tear open the sky like violent blossoms. Shrapnel rattles against aluminum skin. The radio crackles with tension. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. Out of the sun they come. Dark, fast shapes slicing through the clouds, German interceptors diving like hawks. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs closing in for the kill. For years, these bombers flew missions like this with little protection, and the Luftwaffe tore them apart. But today is different. A new sound rises above the chaos. Deep, powerful, relentless. Long-range American fighters surge forward, silver wings flashing in the sunlight. Engines roaring. Guns armed. They don't just defend the bombers anymore. They hunt. High above Nazi Germany, aircraft like the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt begin turning the sky into something the Luftwaffe has never faced before. A battlefield where American fighters are no longer escorts. They are the nightmare. And this is the story of the moment the air war over Europe changed forever. The sky over Europe was never silent during the war. Even miles above the earth, where the air thinned into icy emptiness, the battlefield was alive with sound. The deep rumble of engines rolled across the clouds like distant thunder. Propellers carved the air with violent force. Oxygen masks hissed. Radio chatter snapped in and out through bursts of static. Inside a bomber cockpit, the temperature dropped far below freezing. Frost crawled across the glass. Crew members hunched over their guns, eyes scanning the endless sky. Every man knew what could appear at any moment. A flash of movement. A dark silhouette diving out of the sun. German fighters. For years, the Luftwaffe had perfected the art of destroying bomber formations. They studied the weaknesses, the blind spots, the slow speed of heavy bombers trying to cross hostile skies. When the attack came, it came fast. Messerschmitt Bf 109 streaked through the formation in brutal head-on assaults. Focke-Wulf Fw 190 slashed across the wings of bombers with cannons blazing. Explosions tore through aluminum fuselages. Engines caught fire. Parachutes blossomed across the cold sky. Sometimes entire bomber crews disappeared within seconds. And the worst part for the American airmen wasn't the flak or the fighters. It was the distance. Deep inside Germany, bomber crews knew that help often couldn't reach them. Early escort fighters simply didn't have the range to follow them all the way to their targets. So the bombers continued alone. Through storms of anti-aircraft fire. Through waves of interceptors. Through skies where survival often depended on luck. But war has a way of forcing innovation. Back in American factories and airfields across Britain, engineers and pilots were quietly preparing something that would change everything. Fighters that could fly farther. Fighters that could fight harder. Fighters that could stay with the bombers from the moment they crossed the English Channel until the moment they returned home. And when those fighters finally appeared over Germany, the entire rhythm of the air war began to shift. German pilots climbing toward bomber formations suddenly saw something they had not expected. Fast silver shapes already waiting for them. Long-range American fighters patrolling the sky like predators. The balance of the battlefield had begun to tilt. The hunters of the Luftwaffe were about to discover what it felt like to be hunted themselves. The problem over Europe. By 1943, the United States Army Air Forces had a bold strategy. Destroy Germany's war machine from the sky. Factories. Rail yards. Oil refineries. Daylight precision bombing. Massive bomber formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators crossed the English Channel daily, flying directly into the heart of the Third Reich. The theory sounded powerful. Tight formations of heavily armed bombers defending each other with machine guns. But reality was brutal. German fighters climbed to meet them. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf Fw 190s tore through the bomber streams with deadly efficiency. They attacked from the front, from below, even through the formation itself. Flak exploded everywhere. In October 1943, during the infamous Second Schweinfurt mission, American bombers flew deep into Germany without sufficient escort. The result was catastrophic. 60 bombers shot down. Hundreds of airmen killed or captured. Entire crews vanished in flames above Germany. It became painfully clear, bombers alone could not survive. What they needed was a fighter that could escort them all the way to Berlin, and back. Enter the long-range Guardians. Two aircraft would become the backbone of America's fighter dominance. The P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-51 Mustang. They could not have looked more different. The P-47 Thunderbolt was enormous for a fighter. Heavy. Brutal. Powered by a massive Pratt & Whitney radial engine producing over 2,000 horsepower. Its thick fuselage and rugged construction made it almost indestructible. Pilots called it the Jug. It could dive faster than almost anything in the sky and carried 8.50 caliber machine guns that could shred enemy aircraft in seconds. The P-51 Mustang, on the other hand, was elegance and speed. With its laminar flow wing and sleek fuselage, it cut through the air like a blade. When fitted with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the Mustang transformed into one of the most lethal fighters of the entire war. Fast, agile, deadly, and most importantly, long range. With drop tanks attached under its wings, the Mustang could escort bombers deep into Germany, all the way to Berlin, something no fighter had done before. For the first time, American bombers would not face the Luftwaffe alone. The turning point, early 1944. By early 1944, the skies over Europe began to change. The Allies launched Operation Argument, better known as Big Week. Hundreds of bombers targeted German aircraft factories across the Reich. But this time something different happened. American fighters didn't just stay glued to the bomber formations. They roamed. Mustangs and Thunderbolts swept ahead of the bombers, hunting German interceptors before they could even reach the formations. It was aggressive, dangerous, and devastating. German fighters climbing to attack the bombers suddenly found themselves intercepted, sometimes miles away from their targets. Dogfights erupted everywhere. High-altitude spirals. Gun flashes in the clouds. Aircraft tumbling toward the earth in trails of smoke. The Luftwaffe had been masters of European skies for years. Now they were fighting for survival. A mission over Berlin. March 1944. One of the most dangerous bombing runs of the war. Berlin. Hundreds of American bombers crossed into Germany under heavy cloud cover. German radar detected them almost immediately. Luftwaffe interceptors scrambled. Bf-109s clawed into the sky. Fw-190s roared down runways. Veteran German pilots prepared for another brutal engagement. But as they climbed toward the bomber stream, silver shapes appeared. P-51 Mustangs. Dozens of them. American fighters pounced. Machine guns thundered across the sky as Mustangs dove into the German formations. Dogfights scattered across the cold air above the Reich. German pilots suddenly faced something unfamiliar. They were no longer attacking helpless bombers. They were fighting fighters designed to hunt them. Many Luftwaffe pilots reported the same thing in combat reports. The Mustangs were everywhere. Fast, aggressive, relentless. By the time German fighters reached the bomber formations, many had already been shot down or forced to retreat. Why German pilots feared them? The fear wasn't just about speed or firepower. It was about control of the sky. American fighters could now escort bombers for the entire mission. That meant German pilots had to fight their way through waves of escorts just to reach the bombers. And even if they survived that battle, the escorts would be waiting when they tried to land. Mustangs often followed retreating fighters all the way back to their airfields, strafing runways and destroying aircraft on the ground. German pilot training also began collapsing under the pressure. Veteran pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. New recruits entered combat with only a fraction of the training earlier pilots had received. Against experienced American fighter groups flying advanced aircraft, the odds were devastating, breaking the Luftwaffe. By mid-1944, the balance of air power over Europe had shifted permanently. American fighters dominated the skies. Bombers struck oil refineries, aircraft factories, and transportation networks across Germany. Fuel shortages crippled the Luftwaffe. Aircraft production slowed. Training programs collapsed. German pilots increasingly flew missions knowing they were unlikely to survive. The long-range American fighters had done more than defend bombers. They had shattered the German Air Force. And once the Luftwaffe lost control of the sky, the fate of Nazi Germany was sealed. The effect of the new American fighter tactics was immediate. Instead of flying defensively beside the bomber formations, many escort fighters were now ordered to sweep ahead of the bombers. Their mission was simple: destroy the Luftwaffe before it could even reach the target. This aggressive strategy transformed the air war. American fighters roamed across German skies in wide patrol patterns, searching for enemy aircraft climbing from distant airfields. Radar stations detected incoming bomber streams, and German fighters scrambled to intercept, only to encounter swarms of American escorts already waiting for them. Dogfights exploded across hundreds of miles of sky. Pilots described the battles as chaotic storms of twisting contrails, machine gun fire, and diving aircraft spinning toward the ground. The rugged P-47 Thunderbolt often used its incredible diving speed to escape danger and then climb back into the fight. Meanwhile, sleek P-51 Mustangs hunted enemy fighters with relentless precision. German pilots quickly realized something had changed. The escorts weren't merely protecting bombers anymore. They were actively dismantling the Luftwaffe. And every battle in the sky was slowly draining Germany of the experienced pilots it desperately needed to survive. The war in the air over Europe was never quiet. It was thunder. Engines screaming at full power. Machine guns hammering through thin aluminum skins. Pilots fighting at altitudes where a single mistake meant fire, freezing darkness, and a fall from 30,000 feet. But by 1944, the skies above Germany had changed forever. The arrival of long-range American fighters, especially the P-51 Mustang and the rugged P-47 Thunderbolt, reshaped the entire air war. Before them, bomber crews flew into Germany knowing they were exposed. Before them, the Luftwaffe ruled the skies above the Reich. But once American fighters could escort bombers all the way to their targets, the balance of power shifted dramatically. German interceptors were no longer hunters. They became the hunted. Every mission became a risk. Every climb into the sky meant facing swarms of fast, heavily armed American fighters that refused to break off the fight. And those fighters did more than defend bombers. They destroyed aircraft factories. They shot down experienced German pilots. They crippled the Luftwaffe's ability to protect its own homeland. Fuel depots burned. Rail networks collapsed. Airfields were strafed until wreckage covered the runways. The once dominant German Air Force slowly bled itself dry. By the time Allied armies landed in Normandy in June 1944, the Luftwaffe could barely challenge the invasion. The sky belonged to the Allies. And that control of the air would prove decisive for the rest of the war. Because war is not only won on the ground. It is won by who owns the sky above it. The pilots who flew those long-range fighters carried more than guns and fuel in their wings. They carried the fate of every bomber crew depending on them. They carried the weight of every mission deep into enemy territory. And they carried the moment when the Luftwaffe realized something terrifying. The hunters had become the prey. From that point on, every German pilot climbing into the cold skies above Europe knew one thing. Somewhere beyond the clouds, American fighters were already waiting. When historians look back at the air war over Europe, they often focus on the massive bomber formations, the flying fortresses and liberators that carried the destruction of industrial war deep into Nazi territory. But behind every successful mission was something equally important: the fighters that guarded them. By the final years of the war, American escort fighters had achieved something no air force had managed before: sustained long-range air superiority over enemy territory. That dominance reshaped the battlefield in ways that reached far beyond the sky. German industry struggled under constant bombing. Fuel production collapsed as oil refineries were destroyed. Factories building aircraft and engines were repeatedly hit. Transportation networks fractured under relentless attacks. Without fuel, planes could not fly. Without trained pilots, even the best aircraft were useless. And without control of the skies, Germany's defenses began to crumble. The once fearsome Luftwaffe, an air force that had dominated Europe at the beginning of the war, was slowly reduced to a shadow of its former strength. For the pilots of the American escort fighters, however, victory was never easy. Every mission meant flying hundreds of miles into hostile territory. Every return flight meant scanning the sky for enemy fighters, anti-aircraft fire, or mechanical failure. Some never came back. But their impact was undeniable. The long-range fighters of the United States Army Air Forces didn't just protect bombers. They shattered the enemy's ability to fight in the air. They opened the skies for the Allied invasion of Europe. And they proved that air superiority could shape the outcome of an entire war. High above the battlefields of the Second World War, where the air was thin and the horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, a new kind of dominance had been forged. A dominance built not just on machines, but on the courage of the pilots who flew them into the heart of enemy skies. And from that moment forward, whenever German fighters climbed into the cold blue above the Reich, they faced a reality that could not be ignored. The sky was no longer theirs. It belonged to the fighters that had become their worst nightmare.